My name is Margaret Walker. I'm 73 years old, and if you're reading or listening, then I suppose it means I'm finally ready to tell the truth. Not because I need the world to know, but because I want to remember that I survived it. All of it. I was born in Fairview, Kentucky, in 1950. It was the kind of town where secrets didn't just hide, they thrived. You could walk down Main Street and feel them breathing through the brick walls and shuttered windows tucked beneath the white lace curtains that covered every sin. My family's house sat on the far edge of town, past the sawmill and down a gravel road that turned muddy when it rained. We didn't have much, but we had enough. Enough to stay quiet, enough to make sure no one looked too closely. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you are watching from. I was the youngest of 3. My sister Lillian married early and moved to Ohio. I barely remember her face. But my brother Daniel, he was the son my parents orbited around. Tall, smart, always knew what to say when grown-ups were watching. At school, they said he was bound for something big. At church, women smiled too long when he held the door. And at home, my father called him his pride, Mama called him her protector. They never asked who protected me. Daniel and I shared a room for the first few years, as many siblings did back then. The house was small, and there weren't enough walls for comfort or privacy. We had 2 twin beds on opposite sides of the room. My side had shelves full of dolls and a little rocking chair I loved to sit in with my storybooks. His side had baseball trophies and a radio he kept tuned to the Yankees. We didn't talk much. He was older by 5 years, and to me, he was a giant. The first time he touched me, I was 8. It wasn't violent, not yet. Just a strange stillness that settled in the room as he sat beside me on the edge of my bed and pressed a finger to his lips. "Shh," he whispered, and my body froze because I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew something inside me shifted. Something broke loose. I told Mama the next morning that Daniel had climbed into my bed and touched my hair while I was sleeping. She paused just for a moment before she smiled and said, "He was probably just having a bad dream. Boys do that sometimes." She poured more syrup on my pancakes and said nothing more. I learned 2 things that day. First, my body wasn't mine, and second, silence could taste like sugar. It didn't stop. It didn't escalate quickly either. It crept, little touches when no one was looking, whispers that made my stomach twist. A hand on my knee at the dinner table while my father spoke about politics. A finger tracing my spine during church service when we shared a pew. I started sleeping with my back against the wall. I folded my arms tight over my chest when I sat down. I made myself smaller, quieter. I became an expert in invisibility. Daniel always knew when to be gentle, when to stop just before a line. And when he crossed it the first time, truly crossed it, I had already been softened by years of his rehearsals. There's a photograph from that year I still have in a box somewhere. Easter Sunday, 1961. I'm wearing a yellow dress with lace at the sleeves and a white ribbon in my hair. I'm holding a little wicker basket with dyed eggs and smiling like the world was whole. Mama made that dress by hand, said I looked like a sunflower. Daddy made me spin so he could see the skirt twirl. And Daniel stood just behind me in that photo, resting a hand on my shoulder. His grip was too tight. I didn't flinch. I just smiled for the camera. That night, while everyone slept, he came into my bed. This time, he didn't ask me to be quiet. He didn't need to. I'd already learned the lesson. In this house, the truth was the enemy. I sometimes wonder if they knew. Not just suspected, but truly knew. My father worked long hours, came home smelling of coal and smoke. He was a proud man, not cruel, but hard. He believed men ruled their homes and women endured. My mother Evelyn was a quiet woman, the kind who apologized when she sneezed too loud. She looked away a lot. When Daniel entered a room, she stood straighter. When I entered, she barely looked up from her sewing. I tried to speak once more. I was 10. I asked Mama why Daniel was allowed to sleep in my bed. Her hands paused over the laundry basket. Then she said, "Don't be silly, Margaret. He's your brother. He loves you." That was the first time I realized love could be weaponized. After that, I stopped trying. I buried it. I buried everything. I told myself stories before bed so I could fall asleep. I imagined my dolls whispering protection spells as I clutched them under the covers. I prayed without words, and I wrote, on scrap paper inside book margins in the back of old Bibles. I wrote what I couldn't say. I didn't know it then, but I was planting seeds, words that would one day grow into truth. When I was 9, my body stopped feeling like mine. By 10, my soul had already split in two, one part that the world could see and one that hid beneath the floorboards of my skin. It's strange how the human heart adapts, how it learns to beat quietly so as not to wake the monster it sleeps beside. Daniel began slipping into my bed more often. Sometimes he'd lie there and say nothing, just breathe against the back of my neck while I pretended to be asleep. Other nights he whispered stories or quoted Bible verses. I don't think he believed in God. I think he believed in himself. He made it sound like love, like loyalty. "You're the only one who understands me," he'd say, his hands tracing patterns on my arm. "You make me feel calm." I didn't understand what those words meant then, but I knew they weren't meant for a sister. One night, he kissed me on the forehead and said, "I'd never hurt you, Maggie. I love you more than anyone ever will." I remember lying there, still as a stone, and thinking, love must mean silence. During the day, he went back to being the golden boy. The neighborhood kids followed him like ducklings. My father clapped him on the back, calling him my right hand. Sometimes I watched them from the kitchen window while Mama taught me how to peel potatoes without wasting the skin. "You and your brother are close," she said one afternoon, her voice soft with something like pride. I didn't respond. I had learned that truth had no home in our house. I kept a small notebook hidden under the mattress, pages of half-sentences and scribbled thoughts, things I couldn't say aloud. Some nights I wrote as if to future me, a version of myself who might one day be free. I wrote things like, "It happened again. I didn't cry this time. I think he's getting angrier. Mama saw the bruise on my thigh. She didn't ask." The notebook was the only thing in that room that ever listened. I started excelling at school, not out of ambition, but desperation. The more I could disappear into books, the less real my body felt. I volunteered for every errand, every chore. I became the girl who was so responsible, the one teachers praised and neighbors smiled at in church. But underneath, I was hollowing out. My smiles were muscle memory. My voice always pitched soft, careful, never questioning. I became fluent in the language of pretending. I remember one Sunday, during supper, Daniel reached across the table to pass me the butter. As he did, his fingers lingered a second too long on my wrist. My mother noticed. I know she did, because she looked down at her plate as if it had suddenly offended her. She said nothing, just tightened her grip on her fork until her knuckles went white. That silence, the kind that chokes a room, was louder than any scream. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night from nightmares that didn't feel like dreams at all, but memories wrapped in fog. I'd run to the bathroom and sit on the cold tile floor, knees pulled to my chest, praying to a God I wasn't sure was listening. Please make it stop. Please let someone notice. Please let me disappear. No one did. I didn't. My father believed in hard work and discipline. He thought feelings were for women, and even then, only in moderation. If I cried, he told me I was being dramatic. If I spoke too loudly, he'd glance over the top of his newspaper and say, "That mouth of yours is gonna ruin you one day." So I shrunk myself. I swallowed every sound, every ache. I became so small I barely recognized my own reflection. And Daniel, he grew bolder. There were moments when I thought he might stop. When he started dating a girl from the next county over, I prayed that she would save me, that if he found someone else, he'd forget about me. But abuse isn't about desire, it's about control. He still came to me, still whispered that I was his safe place. He'd press his mouth to my ear and say, "You'd never tell, would you? You're not like other girls. You're better." And I'd nod, not because I believed it, but because I'd learned that resistance only delayed the inevitable. I became obsessed with cleanliness. I scrubbed my sheets so often the fabric thinned and tore. I washed my hands until they cracked. I thought if I could just stay pure on the outside, maybe the inside would follow, but nothing worked. The stain was deep, and no one could see it but me. At school, a teacher once asked if I was feeling okay. "I'd been quiet lately," she said. My eyes looked tired. I smiled. "Just helping out more at home, ma'am." She patted my head and said, "Such a good little girl." Good girls didn't make trouble. Good girls kept secrets. Good girls got hurt and stayed quiet. Sometimes, in the rare moments I had alone, I would sit in the woods behind our house and imagine what it might feel like to run away, to leave everything behind: my name, my body, my blood. But then I'd hear Mama calling me in for dinner, and I'd get up and go back, because that's what I did. I went back. Because in my family, Daniel's love was seen as a gift. But to me, it was a life sentence without parole. If I close my eyes, I can still feel the fabric. Soft cotton, pale yellow, stitched by hand with little white daisies along the hem. Mama made it weeks ahead of Easter, humming as her needle danced. She called it my sunshine dress, said I would look like springtime itself. I remember holding it up against my chest in the mirror, wondering what it would feel like to belong in something so lovely. For a moment, I didn't think about Daniel. I didn't think about the nights, or the whispers, or the bruises I covered. I thought only of lace and sunlight and the possibility of being seen as a child again, just a child. Easter Sunday, 1961. The morning was unusually warm, and the yard smelled like fresh grass and new beginnings. Mama curled my hair and tied it back with a white ribbon. I wore white ankle socks with lace trim and the patent leather shoes that pinched my toes. She looked at me, smiled softly, and said, "You look like something out of a storybook, Margaret." Daddy beamed. He made me twirl in the kitchen so he could see the skirt flare. Daniel stood by the door, arms crossed, eyes lingering too long. I didn't meet his gaze. At church, people smiled. Old women pinched my cheeks. The pastor's wife called me a proper little lady. I clutched my basket of colored eggs and smiled for the camera, standing on the church steps with the sun hitting my face just right. Daniel stood behind me, one hand on my shoulder. In the photograph, it looks like a brotherly pose, but I remember the way his thumb pressed into my skin, just enough to hurt, just enough to remind me, "You're still mine." That afternoon, there was a picnic: fried chicken, deviled eggs, lemonade so sweet it burned the back of my throat. Children ran through the field, shrieking with laughter. I stayed close to Mama. I didn't want to run. I didn't want to play. I wanted the day to last forever, because somehow, deep down, I knew it wouldn't. That night, I laid the dress carefully across the chair in my room. I didn't want to wrinkle it. It still smelled faintly of the breeze and my mother's talcum powder. I was brushing my hair when Daniel came in. No knock, no warning. Just the slow creak of the door, the silence that followed. He sat on my bed, watching me in the mirror. I froze. "You looked beautiful today," he said. My hands trembled, but I forced the brush through my hair. "Mama made the dress," I whispered. "I didn't like how people looked at you." I swallowed hard. "They were just being nice." He stood up, came behind me, placed both hands on my shoulders. I couldn't breathe. My heart thudded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "I don't want anyone else seeing you like that," he said. And then he pulled me toward the bed. I won't describe what happened. Not because I've forgotten, I never will, but because there aren't words that can carry the weight of it properly. What I will tell you is this: it wasn't sudden. It was deliberate. It was quiet. It was a violation wrapped in a whisper, covered by the stillness of a house that had learned to ignore certain sounds. When it was over, he kissed my forehead, told me he loved me, and left. I lay there, knees pulled to my chest, staring at the yellow dress. It hung limp over the chair, innocent, untouched, somehow still clean, while I felt like I had been stained forever. I didn't cry. Not that night. The next morning, I came to breakfast late. Mama was folding laundry at the table. Daddy had already left for work. Daniel sat in his usual spot, eating toast like nothing had happened. Mama looked at me. Her eyes rested on my face for just a second longer than usual. She didn't say anything, just turned back to her towels. That was the moment I knew. She knew, or at least suspected, and she chose not to see. After breakfast, she handed me the dress and told me to hang it carefully in the closet. "We'll save it for next spring," she said. I took it upstairs, held it in my hands for a long time. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear it to pieces. But instead, I folded it gently, just as she taught me, and placed it on the shelf. Because even in rage, I still played the role I was assigned. That dress became a symbol of everything I had lost: my childhood, my voice, my right to be believed. It remained in my closet for years. Every time I opened the door, it sat there like a ghost in soft yellow, reminding me that the world had seen me as lovely, just once, and even that was taken. I stopped writing for a while. My journal entries became sparse, then vanished altogether. What was the point? The words didn't protect me. The truth didn't save me. And no one, not Mama, not God, not even the stars I used to wish on, had come for me. I went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from peace, but the kind that grows like mold in dark corners, the kind that festers, that hardens, that begins to feel like safety, even when it's killing you. Daniel's visits didn't stop. They became part of my routine, like brushing teeth or combing hair. My body became a house with no locks, no rooms of its own, but I kept the dress, because somehow I needed to remember that I had once worn sunshine, even if it had cost me everything. By the time I was 14, my body had become a graveyard of silence. I had learned how to keep my face still while my soul screamed. I had learned to say, "I'm fine," even when my hands were trembling. I had learned to walk past Daniel without flinching, to set the dinner table with the same hands he gripped too tightly at night. And then, one morning, I vomited in the church parking lot. Right after Sunday service, in front of Sister Maybell's rose bushes. Mama said it was probably the ham from the night before. But I already knew. Somehow, deep down, I already knew. It wasn't just nausea. It was the way my skin felt tight across my stomach. The heaviness in my chest. The way my body no longer belonged to me again, but in a new, deeper way. Something had taken root. I was pregnant. Of course, I didn't have those words yet, not out loud. I only had fear and shame and the kind of certainty that grows quietly like mildew on the inside of a locked drawer. Something you don't want to touch, but you know is spreading. When I told Mama, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stared at me for a long time. Her face didn't change, not even when I said Daniel's name. Then she stood, went into the kitchen, and began boiling water. She made me drink tea every morning, dark, bitter, filled with herbs I couldn't name. She said it would set things right, said it was good for a girl's body. I understood what she meant. I understood she wasn't trying to help me carry anything, but the tea didn't work. The nausea got worse. My belly began to swell, just enough to notice beneath my dresses. Daniel grew quiet. He stopped coming to my room, at least for a while. I thought maybe the baby would bring the truth out into the open. Maybe it would force the world to see what had been done to me. Maybe, just maybe, Mama would finally speak. I was wrong. Daniel came to me one afternoon with a plan. He smiled like it was a game. "We're going to say it's Luke's," he said. Luke Dobbins, the soft-spoken boy who sat 2 rows behind me in history class. He once offered me a pencil when mine broke during a test. That was the extent of our relationship. "He stares at you," Daniel continued. "People will believe it. I'll make sure they do." I didn't get to object. I didn't get to agree. It wasn't my story anymore. Within a week, the town was buzzing. Whispers spread through the school like wildfire. Margaret Walker's pregnant. She fooled around with that Dobbins boy. He always seemed quiet, but you never know. Luke was pulled from class, then from school entirely. His father came storming into the principal's office demanding answers. I saw Luke's face once across the street as his mother dragged him to their truck. He looked at me like I was someone he didn't recognize anymore, someone he wished he hadn't tried to be kind to. That night, Daddy punched a hole in the wall. "A child in this house, and you lie with boys like you got no name to protect?" he yelled. I stood there barefoot, stomach fluttering, and said nothing. Mama stood behind him, silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. Luke's family left Fairview by the end of the month. Their trailer was packed up before sunrise. The rumors followed them, of course. That kind of scandal sticks like smoke. You can scrub everything down, but the smell lingers. At school, no one looked me in the eye anymore. Teachers spoke to me slowly, like I was already broken. Girls whispered in clusters. Boys laughed too loudly. I wasn't a person anymore. I was a cautionary tale. And through it all, Daniel walked freely. He offered me knowing glances across the dinner table, put a hand on my shoulder in church. He even signed my birthday card with, "Always here for you, love, Daniel." The cruelty wasn't in the act, it was in the performance. The theater of normalcy he forced us all to participate in. I stopped writing in my notebook altogether. What was left to say? The words had betrayed me. The truth had been twisted. My voice, when it finally tried to rise, had been handed over to someone else and weaponized. And inside me, something was growing. A child. A secret. A sentence that didn't belong to me, but was mine to carry. Mama continued brewing her teas. Daniel kept his hands off me for now. Daddy fixed the hole in the wall with plywood and paint, and I learned how to move through the house like a shadow. I counted the weeks by the tightness of my dresses, by how much longer I could pretend nothing was happening. There was no doctor. No appointment, no baby books or midnight cravings. There was only silence, and the unbearable weight of a truth no one wanted to hold. It was just past midnight when my water broke. I was 15 years old, barefoot in the kitchen, clutching the edge of the counter while the world tilted under me. Mama had just finished wiping down the stove when it happened. She froze for a moment, long enough for me to see the fear flicker behind her eyes, then wordlessly rolled up her sleeves. She didn't ask if I was ready. She didn't ask how I felt. She just told me to lie down on the linoleum, right there between the sink and the back door, and bring towels. No hospital, no midwife. Just old rags, boiled water, and the sound of Daniel pacing upstairs. I remember the smell, iron and vinegar and something animal. I remember the coldness of the floor seeping into my back as the contractions gripped me like a curse being ripped from bone. I didn't scream. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But the silence had been trained into me like a language. Mama crouched beside me, her hands steady, her mouth a tight line. She whispered prayers as if that could absolve the both of us. When the baby finally came, he didn't cry right away. There was a terrible pause, a kind of suspended breath where even the walls seemed to wait. Then, finally, a wail, thin, shrill, alive, a boy, my son. She laid him on my chest, and for a second I felt nothing, not joy, not love, just a vast echoing numbness, like the hollow after an earthquake when the dust is still settling and you haven't counted the dead yet. "What do you want to call him?" Mama asked softly. I looked at his face. He had Daniel's nose, my mouth, a head of dark hair matted with sweat. "Charles," I said. I don't know why. Maybe because it sounded strong. Or maybe because it didn't belong to anyone we knew. Mama nodded, wiped him clean, and wrapped him in one of my old blankets. By morning, Daniel had already claimed him. He came down the stairs, eyes alight, his voice filled with a terrifying warmth. "He looks like me," he said, reaching for the baby like a father at a christening. "He's mine. You see that, don't you, Maggie?" I didn't answer. "He's part of us now. He makes everything right. Right. As if anything about this could be made right." I watched him hold my son, our son, with the same hands that had ruined my childhood. I watched him rock the baby with a softness that made me sick. And I felt something ancient rise up inside me. Not anger, not even fear, something colder, something final. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house creaked and sighed around me like it was remembering too much. Charles slept in a basket beside my bed, his tiny chest rising and falling like a metronome of guilt. I slipped my hand under the mattress and found the kitchen knife I'd hidden there 2 weeks before. It wasn't sharp. The handle was worn. But it was real. I held it in the dark and imagined pressing it to Daniel's throat the next time he came near me. I imagined the silence afterward, the freedom, but I couldn't do it. Not because I was afraid of him, because I was afraid of what would happen to Charles if I did. I was trapped not just in the house, not just in the silence, but in a kind of twisted motherhood that no one warns you about. Loving your child and hating the reason he exists. Wanting to protect him with your life while also knowing he is made from the very thing that destroyed you. I tried. I really did. I sang to him softly in the mornings. I warmed milk for him even when my hands shook. I held him to my chest and whispered stories I used to tell myself before sleep. I let him grab my fingers. I let him nestle under my chin. And still beneath it all was the sickness. Not in him, in me. A shame so deep it curled around my spine like a parasite. I smiled at him with tears still drying on my cheeks. I brushed his hair with trembling hands. I told him I loved him and meant it even when I couldn't bear to look at his face for more than a moment. Daniel came to see him every day. He didn't touch me anymore, not since the pregnancy. But he hovered, lurked in the doorway, asked if Charles had smiled yet, brought him a wooden rattle, called him my boy in front of Daddy, who still didn't know or pretended not to. Mama never said much. She helped when the baby cried, changed diapers, boiled bottles, but she never called herself Grandma. She never kissed him. She never asked how I was sleeping. I think part of her hoped the baby would heal something, that it would act as penance for what she hadn't protected. But that isn't how healing works. You can't unshatter glass. I began counting days again, not to mark time, but to measure distance. From who I'd been, from what I'd survived. From the girl in the yellow dress who once believed lace could save her. Some nights I would wake and just stare at the knife under my bed, not to use it, just to remember that I still had a choice, even if I wasn't ready to make it. Daddy died on a Tuesday. He'd been out chopping wood behind the house, same as always, wearing the same flannel shirt and same stiff-laced boots he'd worn every winter since I was a girl. Mama said he came in, sat down in his chair, and never stood up again. Stroke, the doctor said. Quick and final. A mercy if you believe in such things. I didn't cry. Not because I didn't care, because by then, grief had become something I wore under my clothes, silent, scratchy, invisible to everyone but me. His death was just one more weight placed on a back already bowed. The funeral was held at the church where I once threw up in the rose bushes, the same church where people whispered behind their hymnals about the girl with the baby and no ring. Daniel stood at the front in Daddy's suit, too broad in the shoulders, too proud in the chest, reading scripture like a man born for the role. I stood near the back with Charles on my hip. He was nearly a year old by then, still too small to understand, but too big to ignore. He had started to walk along the edges of furniture, babbling nonsense and clapping when people smiled at him. After the service, Daniel took the reins, literally. He drove Daddy's truck home, sat in Daddy's chair, and by sundown he had moved into Daddy's room. Mama didn't argue. She cleared the drawers as if she'd been expecting it, and I realized then, the man of the house had died, but the monster had already unpacked his bags. There was a reading of the will, such as it was a crumpled document kept in a locked tin box under Daddy's bed. Everything was left to Daniel. The house, the land, the truck, the guns, even the antique radio in the parlor. Mama got to stay as long as she wished, so long as she didn't cause trouble. As for me, there was no mention, no name, no provision, no apology, just silence. Daniel looked at me after the lawyer left, smiled, said, "You and the boy'll be taken care of." Taken care of, like a dog or a debt. I took Charles upstairs and sat with him on the floor. He giggled as he tried to untie the laces of my shoes. His little hands were so eager, so trusting. I looked into his face, and for the first time, I couldn't pretend anymore. He was starting to look like Daniel, not just in the nose or the chin, but in the way he watched me, studied me. There was something too aware in his eyes, too familiar in the tilt of his head when he didn't get what he wanted. He wasn't even two, and already I could feel it, something sharpening beneath the softness. And I thought, if I stay, he'll become him. That thought pinned me to the floor harder than grief ever could. Because it wasn't just about what had happened to me anymore. It was about what I might pass on, what I might fail to stop, what might grow in my son's heart if raised by silence and fear. Daniel began talking about building a shed, expanding the house, starting a proper life. With me. "It's time we stopped pretending," he said one night, sitting on the edge of my bed uninvited. "You and me. We already have a family." I looked at the knife in the drawer. He followed my eyes, smirked. "Still got that thing?" he asked. "You wouldn't hurt me. You're not like that." I didn't answer, but inside, something was shifting. Not rage. Not yet. That would come later. What moved inside me was colder, steadier, a clarity. I couldn't stay. Not just for me, for Charles. Because if I stayed, I would be teaching him that monsters wear familiar faces, that love means control, that silence is survival, and I had survived long enough. That night, I rocked Charles to sleep in the corner of our room, humming a lullaby Mama used to sing before she stopped using her voice for anything but shame. I watched his eyelids flutter, his breath slow. Then I turned off the light and made my first decision in years. I would run, not tomorrow, not recklessly, but soon, quietly, completely. I never imagined I'd become a thief, but that's exactly what I was. The night I wrapped Charles in a blanket, tucked my journal into my bag, and slipped out through the kitchen door without so much as a backward glance. I didn't take jewelry or cash or the title to the house, just my child, my silence, and the small flicker of a future that hadn't yet been destroyed. The plan had taken weeks. I waited until spring, when the nights were warmer and the neighbors less suspicious of activity after dark. Daniel had taken up hunting again, disappearing into the woods on weekends, as if killing things with fur might return something manly to his life. Mama had grown quieter still, her hands trembling more each time she poured tea. The only person I told was Julie, sweet Julie from church, a girl a few years older than me who worked part-time at the library and never asked too many questions. I caught her in the back aisle between cookbooks and Bibles and whispered, "I need to leave. I have nowhere to go." She didn't blink, just nodded and said, "My cousin lives in Cincinnati. She owes me a favor." That was all. No questions, no pity, only help. On the last night, I fed Charles mashed carrots and let him fall asleep with his hand wrapped around my finger. I packed one change of clothes for each of us, $3 in coins, and the knife still dull, still mine. I kissed Mama's cheek while she stood at the sink, not turning to look. "I'm leaving tonight," I said softly. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then, still facing the window, she whispered, "Protect him, the way I didn't protect you." That was all she said, and I knew, in that moment, it was the closest she could come to an apology. Julie picked us up in her brother's car at midnight, a blue Chevy with a missing hubcap and a glove box that wouldn't close. Charles stirred once in my lap, but didn't cry. The air smelled like honeysuckle and gasoline. "You sure?" she asked as we turned onto the highway. I looked out at the night, thick with promise and fear. "I have to be." The road out of Fairview was lined with ghosts: my school, the church, the old ice cream stand where I once dropped a cone and cried for an hour. They faded in the rearview mirror like dreams you don't want to remember. We reached the outskirts of Cincinnati just before dawn. Julie drove straight to a budget motel off I-75, the kind with buzzing neon signs and vending machines that ate your change. She handed me a key. "You've got 3 nights. After that, her friend can maybe help with something more stable. Don't use your real name." I clutched her hand. "Thank you." She just nodded. Make it count. Inside the motel room, the air was cold and the carpet stained. Charles woke as I laid him on the bed, blinking up at me like none of it made sense. "This is home for now," I whispered, brushing his hair aside. Later that morning, the woman at the front desk asked if I was running from a man. I froze. She raised an eyebrow. "I've seen the look before." I said nothing. She handed me a plastic spoon and a tiny cup of cereal and said, "We don't ask questions, but we do change the locks if you need." In that ugly little room, I learned how to breathe again. I taught Charles how to walk between the bed and the dresser. I sang lullabies even when my voice cracked. I found a Goodwill 2 blocks away and bought him a blue sweater for $1. I called myself Mary when the motel manager asked for a name. Each day, I waited for Daniel to burst through the door, for the police to call me a kidnapper, for someone to say I didn't look like a mother worth saving. But no one came. No one came. And for the first time in years, I began to imagine what it might mean to stay gone, to not just run, but to rebuild. The motel let me stay. At first, I cleaned rooms, stripped sheets, scrubbed tubs with bleach until my knuckles split. I worked fast and kept quiet traits that went unnoticed in most places. But here, they were currency. After a week, the manager, Mrs. Corman, offered me a permanent shift and a cot in the storage room. She didn't ask about Charles. She just said, "As long as the boy doesn't scream at night, you're good." He didn't, not once. He'd grown into a quiet child, curious but cautious, the kind of boy who watched before speaking and held onto my sleeve even after he learned to walk. Some nights I wondered what damage I had passed down through my womb. Other nights I held him to my chest and thanked whatever God would listen that he still reached for me at all. Then there was Edward, Mr. Edward Langston, room 6, long-term guest. A retired postman who walked with a cane and read thick books with yellowing pages. He never spoke unless spoken to, never smiled unless a child waved first. The first time I cleaned his room, I found a bowl of butterscotch candies left beside the sink. A folded note. "For your boy. He looks like a good one." I didn't trust it at first. Men didn't offer kindness without a cost. But Edward never asked for anything. He'd nod politely when he passed us in the hallway. Sometimes he'd drop $1 on the desk and say, "For the growing feet." Occasionally he'd hand Charles a book, always worn and gently loved. "The Wind in the Willows," "Charlotte's Web," "Where the Red Fern Grows." Charles, who barely spoke to strangers, took to Edward as if his spirit knew something mine had forgotten. Not all men were devils. One afternoon, Edward sat on the bench behind the motel, watching Charles chase dandelions. I was folding towels nearby, always half listening, always half ready to flee. He looked at me and said, "He's going to be a good man one day." I nodded, unsure how to reply. Then he added softer, "Because you taught him not to be afraid of love." I turned away so he wouldn't see the tears. A year passed like that, then another. We moved from the storage room to a tiny unit behind the office. I saved every dollar I could. Mrs. Corman taught me how to keep books and run the night desk. Edward brought Charles a bicycle with training wheels for his 5th birthday, and one day, out of nowhere, he handed me a key. "There's a house," he said. "Mine, empty now, 2 bedrooms and a porch swing. It's yours, no rent. Just keep the flowers watered." I tried to argue. I told him I hadn't earned that kind of gift. He shook his head. "You earned it the day you chose peace over revenge." I never forgot that line. We moved into the house that spring. The floors creaked and the roof leaked when it rained too hard, but it was ours. For the first time, I slept without the knife. For the first time, I didn't bolt the door. Charles had a real bed, a real window, a yard to dig in. It was a small life, but it was quiet, and quiet to me was the closest thing to heaven. Charles asked about his father once. He was 6. We were planting marigolds near the porch, his fingers covered in dirt, his voice soft with uncertainty. "Mama, who was my daddy?" I didn't pause. I had practiced this. "His name was Thomas Smith," I said. "He loved books, and fishing, and peach cobbler." Charles blinked. "Where is he now?" I looked up at the sky. Somewhere peaceful. Somewhere full of trees. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to digging. That night, I wrote the name Thomas Smith in the back of my journal, underlined it twice. A made-up man, a patchwork of kindness and fiction. But in that moment, it was a better inheritance than the truth, because the truth was too cruel. And Charles deserved a beginning that wasn't built from ashes. Edward passed 2 years later. Quietly, in his sleep. He left no children, no spouse, just the house, the swing, and a box of letters I found in the closet unsent, written to a brother he'd once loved and lost. Grief, it seemed, had touched us both, in different ways. I buried him with one of Charles's drawings tucked into his coat pocket. A crayon sun with wide arms and a smiling face, the only goodbye I could offer without words. That night, Charles sat beside me on the porch, eating peanut butter from the jar with a spoon. He leaned against my arm and said, "I like it here, Mama." And I said, "Me too, baby." I didn't tell him that for years I'd slept with my shoes near the door in case we had to run again. I didn't tell him I still had nightmares where the walls of our old house grew teeth. I didn't tell him that his real father's name tasted like poison in my mouth. I just held him close and whispered, "We're safe now." And for the first time, I believed it might be true. Charles grew up with kindness in his bones. I used to watch him from the kitchen window as he helped Mrs. Klein next door carry her groceries, or as he sat patiently with stray animals that wandered into our yard, whispering soft things until they stopped shaking. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam doors. When angry, he went outside and pulled weeds until his fingers were raw. Sometimes I wondered if gentleness skipped generations like blue eyes or cleft chins. Other times, I believed he built it himself, stone by stone, against the winds of a past he never knew. He earned a scholarship to a state college, said goodbye on the front porch with a hug that lasted too long, and a look in his eyes that told me he sensed I was more afraid than proud. I waved as he drove off, then went inside and cried into the sweater he forgot to pack. I never told him what Daniel had done. Never told him that the man he thought of as Thomas Smith was no more real than the bedtime stories I used to make up on stormy nights. Instead, I wrote the truth down, in the same journal I had once hidden under the mattress. I filled every page with the silence I had carried. The nights, the pain, the tea Mama made, the child born on linoleum. I wrote not because I wanted him to know, but because I needed to put it somewhere, to drag the story from my body and place it into ink. Then one day after Charles finished graduate school, after he married a girl with a laugh like wind chimes, after they gave me a granddaughter who called me Grandma Maggie, I burned it. I lit the fireplace and fed the journal in, page by page. I watched the ink curl and vanish. I did not cry. It was not an act of forgetting. It was an act of release. Because Charles had built a life from hope, from honesty, from love. He became a teacher, taught history to middle schoolers, and came home with marker stains on his cuffs and stories about kids who reminded him of himself. His wife, Eliza, was kind in the ways that counted, never raising an eyebrow when I needed silence, always asking if I wanted tea before asking questions. They had a little house in the suburbs, white trim and a lilac bush by the fence. I visited every Sunday. My granddaughter Clara liked to braid my thinning hair with plastic barrettes and tell me that she'd grow up to be a ballerina, astronaut, veterinarian. I told her she'd be brilliant at all three. There was a peace I had not dared imagine. Until one afternoon, years later, when I sat folding laundry with the television humming behind me. It was background noise, always had been, but something in the anchor's voice caught my ear, something tight, familiar. They were talking about Fairview. My hands froze over a stack of Charles's baby clothes I'd kept like relics. The screen showed a house, barely changed. Police tape, a faded porch swing. A reporter mentioned words like disappearance, cold case, missing person from 1962. A photograph flashed across the screen. Blurry, black and white. It was Daniel. Older, somehow. But still him. Same eyes, same smug twist of the mouth. My breath caught in my chest like a punch to the ribs. Charles called from the other room. "You want coffee, Mom?" I fumbled for the remote and turned the TV off. Sat in silence. Yes, I thought. Yes, I want coffee. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked into the kitchen like nothing had ever happened. Because that life, the one I had run from, clawed my way out of, was not mine anymore. I had chosen not to be its last chapter. I had chosen instead to raise a man who would never learn cruelty in his cradle. Who would never fear the creak of the stairs or the sound of his own name in the dark. Charles was not Daniel's son. He was mine. And even though he would never know the full truth, he carried it in his choices. In the way he reached for his daughter when she cried. In the way he looked his wife in the eye and said thank you for the small things. In the way he held my hand across hospital beds and Sunday dinners and moments of quiet grief. I had seen what darkness could create, but now I knew what light could undo. I am 73 years old. My hair has thinned, my hands tremble when I thread a needle, and sometimes the names of flowers escape me, even though I planted them. But there are things I remember with startling clarity, like the weight of a child in my arms, or the sound of my mother turning away, or the particular hush that falls just before a door opens you prayed would stay shut. People think silence is weakness, a passive thing, a lack of fight, but they are wrong. Silence can be a blade, too, a shield, a choice. I did not speak because I was afraid at first, but in time, my silence became something else. It became an offering, a gift I gave to the boy I carried through fire and into the world. I chose not to tell Charles the truth, not because I couldn't, but because I would not let that truth define him. I lied. I created Thomas Smith out of lace and lullabies and the smell of fishing lines and good books. I spoke him into being because I needed my son to believe that kindness had existed in his making, that he had been wanted, that he came from love, not from a house full of locked doors and unspeakable things. And the miracle, he believed it. He believed he came from love, and so he gave love. He built a life that no one expected from a child of mine. No rage, no cruelty, just patience and laughter and second chances. He fathered a child who knows nothing of shadows and everything of wonder. He became the kind of man I never met until too late in life, the kind I made up to save him. And now, as the years grow quieter, I've made peace with the lie. It was not cowardice. It was love in its rawest, most desperate form, because not every truth deserves a voice. Some truths are graves, and I was not willing to bury him in mine. People ask what legacy means. I used to think it was money, property, a name etched into something permanent, but now I know better. Legacy is a child who breaks the cycle. It's the moment a woman sees herself in her granddaughter's unafraid eyes and knows we made it out. It's choosing not to tell the story if it means someone else can fly. And if you, dear one, are still living in the shadow of someone else's silence, know this. There is always a crack for the light to find you. It may be small, it may take years, but it will come. And when it does crawl through it, dig with your fingers, drag yourself out if you must, but don't stay. Don't stay in the dark just because someone else told you it was home. You are not the worst thing that happened to you. You are the door that stayed shut long enough to keep the storm from reaching your child. And that matters. So here I am, wrinkled, worn, at peace. I will die with the truth buried deep, not because I'm ashamed, but because I've already witnessed what life looks like when someone is given wings instead of chains. My son flies. That is enough. That is everything. If you're still living in silence, in memories no one knows, in pain that has no name, then Margaret's story is a gentle reminder. You are not alone. Some wounds cannot be spoken aloud, but they can still be healed with love, with the quiet decision to stop passing down the darkness. We can't change where we began, but we can choose where we end. You may not be ready to tell your story yet, but if one day you find the strength to speak, do it. In a whisper, in a journal, or in a story shared here. Grandma's Final Chapter is a space where we honor the quiet last chapters of women who were once forgotten. Each story is a testament to the endurance of the human heart. If you saw a piece of yourself in this story, please like, share, and help it reach those who may need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to Grandma's Final Chapter to hear more stories like this, final chapters that are quiet but never meaningless. And if you're still in the dark, please believe there is always a crack where the light gets in.